Can you hear me? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Great to have you here with us. Thanks for coming. My name is Orit Segev, and I'm the Sector Manager for Health at Genome BC. And let me just show you a short video that you'll get to know us.
Imagine a world where we can fully understand the biological functions of ourselves and other living things. This world exists through genomics, the study of an organism's genome, the map of its DNA, the blueprints of life. Genomics is how we understand biological processes, whether they occur in the laboratory, the ocean, a mine site, a farm, or a hospital. It has the potential to provide solutions to humankind's challenges, to transform human healthcare, to harness the power of our natural resources while protecting our environment for future generations. Genome BC is at the hub of genomics in British Columbia. We partner with academia, government, and industry to build an informed community around the growth of a world-class genomics R&D cluster, delivering sustainable social and economic benefits to BC, Canada, and beyond. Since 2000, Genome British Columbia has been a catalyst for genomics on Canada's west coast. Our work expands across sectors such as forestry, fisheries and aquaculture, agri-food, energy and mining, and human health, helping create innovative applications and partnerships for the life sciences cluster, fostering commercialization, and providing proactive leadership in exploring the societal impacts of genomics. We're putting an informed public at the forefront by visiting communities around BC and connecting people with the important role genomics play in our future. Genome BC is supported by the Province of British Columbia and the Government of Canada through Genome Canada and Western Economic Diversification of Canada, and more than 300 international public and private co-funding partners. The field of genomics is helping fuel British Columbia's bioeconomy. With genomics, we can begin to create the future that we could only previously imagine, a future where we simultaneously reduce our negative impact on the environment and maximize the opportunity of our rich natural resources, a future where we can feed the world's growing population, a future where personalized medicine does not compromise a sustainable healthcare system. A better future for British Columbia, Canada, and the world through Genome BC, leading, investing, connecting.
Okay, I'll be the moderator of today's talk, which is supported by Genome BC, and it's the first talk in a number of exciting public addresses across a broad range of science disciplines. Today, we will be discussing the role of genomics in saving lives and improving the quality of life for patients through the prediction of drug response and prevention of serious, unexpected, and unwanted reactions to drugs. Before introducing our panelists, I would like to invite you to watch a short video courtesy of the UBC Sequencing Center, which helps to illustrate the importance of pharmacogenomics, or in other words, how our genes affect a person's response to drugs.
Our bodies, like all living things, are made up of cells. Inside each cell is something called DNA, which is a molecule that determines whether we're a tree, a dog, or a human. DNA is composed of a string of 4 smaller molecules called bases that pair up and string together in long winding ladders. Our unique DNA sequence is called a genome, and in humans is made up of 3 billion base pairs. If you were to compare the DNA of one human to another, you would find 99.9% of those 3 billion pairs of letters are the same. It is that 0.1% difference that makes each of us unique and determines who we are. This is known as our genotype. Our genome defines who we can be and can determine how our bodies respond to different medications. All medications have the potential to cause side effects. These can range from mildly annoying, like a rash, to severe or even life-threatening, Little is known about how or why these side effects occur, and it is often difficult to predict them. Part of the answer lies within our genes. Genes are segments of DNA that provide instructions for how our bodies develop and function. While every individual's DNA contains a similar set of genes, some genes have certain variants that increase the chances of experiencing certain side effects. In the same way that gene variants combine to specify how tall you are or what color eyes you have, different gene variants may lead to unusual responses to certain medications. The results of these gene combinations are called traits, or more technically, phenotypes. A phenotype is an observable trait resulting from the interaction of genes and the environment. Everything besides our genes, such as the meal you ate in the morning, is part of your environment, as is the drug you took with your meal. Because environment can vary so dramatically, it is essential to consider both genes and environment when thinking about drug effects. This is the essence of what we call pharmacogenomics. But how do we find out which gene variants are associated with different responses to medication? Fortunately, genetic tests can help us, and this is where we need you. Until recently, we tested genes one at a time. Advances in technology now allow us to sequence or read DNA in a single test using a simple saliva sample. We can then compare the gene variants of people who experience similar responses to medication. By using these methods, we hope to expand our knowledge of pharmacogenomics and use it to make us all healthier. Our goal is that one day we'll be able to use your own unique DNA sequence to predict your response to medication.
Okay, this video is probably raising a lot of questions. So this is the time to introduce our speakers. We have a panel of 3 experts. Each brings with him or her a different perspective. Each of the panelists will present for 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Note that you can also join us on Twitter during the event, so feel free to follow us. As you can see, at Genome BC, #GBCPGX. And we will present the questions to the speakers. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker today is Martin Dawes. Martin is a professor of family practice at the University of British Columbia. He started his clinical practice as a family physician in Oxford, UK, and then ran the UK Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. In 2002, Martin became professor and head of family practice at McGill University and moved to UBC in 2010 to be the head of family practice. His research includes implementation of pharmacogenomics in primary care and lifestyle interventions to prevent diabetes. The second speaker, Bryce Wong, is the general manager of RxOme Pharmacogenomics Canada, a joint venture between the BC Pharmacy Association and MyDNA, a company which seeks to enable community pharmacies to make pharmacogenomic testing and consultation available to the patients across Canada. He was previously the senior manager of pharmacy practice support at the BC Pharmacy Association. Amani Saini will be our last speaker, and she will focus on the patient experience, public perception, and policy. Amani is the founder and president of Adverse Drug Reaction Canada, which advocates for the use of genomics in guiding health decisions and prescription of drugs, and for the implementation of policies to prevent adverse drug reactions. Amani received the 2016 Canadian Science Policy Award of Excellence, which recognizes an individual who developed an innovative and compelling evidence-based policy that will make a positive difference for Canadians. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I'd like to invite Martin, please, to give us the first presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you and hopefully answer some of your questions. It is a real honor to be in front of an audience of people who are unique, and that is really what we're addressing. For 50 years or so, medicines have been treating averages. And we have been not treating you as an average. We've certainly been doing patient-centered care, but the information we've been getting has been limited to treating people as averages. Genetics turns that on its head. Now we can start to individualize therapy, and that's what I'm going to show you that we're doing now. The first thing to say is that drugs don't work in all people. About half the drugs don't work in the people that we give them to, and on the left-hand side, you'll see the list of conditions there, and the height of the bar is actually the effectiveness. So you can see that painkillers are effective in 4 out of 5 people on the left-hand side, but Alzheimer's treatments at the moment, 30% effectiveness. So 30% of the people we give the Alzheimer's treatment to are responding in the way we would expect. And if you look at that bottom statement on the left-hand side, the improvement in survival for 71 drugs approved for patients with cancer is about 2 months. So this is the struggle. The other part of the equation is the amount of harm drugs are doing. Some of that is because of mislabeling, and you can see an example of taking a tablet into the right eye. Some of it is just the lottery of giving a drug and not knowing what's going to happen to that individual. And as a result, 500,000 people die worldwide from prescription medications. So in Canada, we're talking about 10 to 20,000 people. So here's genetics. It's complex. Most family physicians will run a mile when I put up that slide. They will say, I don't understand the terminology. What is an allele? This is not something I was taught in medical school. In fact, I may have been taught it, but I forgot it amongst the mass of other things I was being taught. And it's challenging for us to know this science and to understand terms like ultrametabolizer. I wanted to put this slide up because the genetics sounds really complex. That machine on the right that looks like a wine cooler is actually what our lab uses to isolate and extract your DNA. It actually is pretty small. And the machines that do whole genome sequencing are not much bigger than that. The power comes in the interpretation. This is Drug Metabolism 101. I give something to you, and then it either gets excreted through the kidneys or it gets metabolized by the liver. Sometimes it gets changed into an active compound. Sometimes it gets converted from an active compound to an inactive compound. You can already see how complex this is. That, unfortunately, is the picture of metabolomic pathways that I had to learn some of as a medical student. And again, you can see the challenge of trying to take that and to try and include drugs with that. This is a slide about the frequency of your individuality. We talked about you being unique. Look at the bottom one with codeine. 10% of us have a variant in our system that means that we don't translate codeine to morphine in the way that I would expect as a physician. 3% of us do it far too actively. It shoots up into morphine and then drops like a stone. And others, 7%, hardly get any morphine from the codeine they're given. And look at the other drugs. These are drugs for depression, for indigestion, for reducing clotting for people with atrial fibrillation, for reducing cholesterol. They're really common drugs. And look at the frequencies of the population affected. So you might think, oh, genetics, pharmacogenetics is rare. Not a bit of it. And this explains some of our reactions to drugs. 97% of the patients we did in this study, which is Vancouver and Vancouver Island, actually had one variant, and this was a limited panel of just 30 variants we were looking at. Okay, stepping back, I said it's how you translate it is really key. My thermostat at home is smarter than my electronic medical record. My thermostat learns. It knows when I'm out of the house. It programs itself, I have no idea how, and it seems to come on when I get home. My car is a lot smarter than my medical record. My medical record does not even recognize what I prescribe frequently for people and suggest it. It doesn't learn about doing lab tests. It doesn't learn how to inform me to make my care better. It is a very flat system and has no learning whatsoever. That is the decision support that we give to our residents at UBC. It is a book. And you may think we're, one of the smartest universities in the world, and we are. But around the world, medical students and residents are using that sort of technology, books, to learn about adverse drug reactions. And now I need to include genetics. You can see the barriers that we face. So how do we get past that? Because we have to use this genetic information. We have to stop the harm. So the big bars on the left-hand side in blue are conventional medicine. The bars that are really small on the right are using machine learning to improve diagnosis for several conditions, Alzheimer's, bone fractures, and breast cancer. It's an example of how machine learning and artificial intelligence is helping us as physicians improve our care for you. So what we did at UBC is took all the world literature on how to prescribe. We took groups of individuals, epidemiologists, scientists. We took a lot of computing power. We created algorithms. And what we've done is create a solution that you can have in your smartphone to identify the drugs for you. Because basically this is rules. This is all a lot of rules that we get taught as a medical student that we can put into a computer program that we can then create machine learning from. So those are the variables that I need to think about in the 1 minute I've got to identify the right drug for you. And it includes your liver function, your kidney function, the state of your disease, the other drugs you're taking, the other drugs you've tried taking, other diseases you might have. For example, if you've got diabetes and blood pressure, I need to change treatments because of that combination. And I have to do that within a minute. So there's 11 sets of variables. For each individual, that might be 50 items that need to go into that decision. I bet your doctor, like me, does not look at all those variables. Just don't have time. And now I add the genetics. So what we've done is created, through those rules, this system. So that's the output of pressing the button and seeing which drugs are safe and effective for the individual. It interprets the clinical situation and the genetics, it calculates the dose, and it interprets the drug interactions. We've partnered with Life Labs to do the actual testing, so Life Labs are now with us offering the tests. It's a saliva test, as you've heard on the video there. And so individuals can have, as I said, on their smartphone, that's a shot of my phone, and it says something about a decreased response to one of the drugs for type 2 diabetes. And what you do is you combine that with the thoughtfulness and care of a professional and give them the tools on the smartphone to create safer prescribing for individuals. This information is now available. This is being used by individuals in Canada today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Bryce would be our second speaker.
Thank you. So I just wanted to say thank you to Genome BC for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's my pleasure to be here. So I was asked to provide the pharmacist perspective on pharmacogenomics and adverse drug reactions. I think it's quite well known that adverse drug reactions have a significant impact on patients. Over hundreds of thousands of patients across Canada are impacted by adverse drug reactions every year, and the impact on the healthcare system is significant, to the tunes of millions to billions of dollars, depending on what studies you're looking at. And so, like Martin's alluding to, we need better tools, including pharmacogenomic testing, including better decision support tools to avoid these types of adverse drug reactions. So I thought I'd talk a little bit differently, though. What I thought I would talk about, spend my couple minutes talking about, is kind of what is the role of pharmacists in terms of, more generally, and then what is the role of the pharmacist in terms of preventing or managing adverse drug reactions, and where do we see pharmacists in terms of making use out of some of this pharmacogenomic information. So I thought I'd start my description of the pharmacist with a clip, and some of you may have heard it. This is a bit from Jerry Seinfeld.
And why does that pharmacist have to be 2.5 feet higher than everybody else? Who the hell is this guy? Clear out, everybody. I'm working with pills up here. I'm taking them from this big bottle, and then I'm going to put them in a little bottle. That's my whole job. I can't be down on the floor with you people. Yes, I'd like to get this prescription filled, please. All right, but you wait down there. No one comes up here but me.
So hopefully none of you have had that experience in your pharmacy or have that perception of the pharmacy. That bit was probably performed in the 90s, but a lot has changed in the world of pharmacy since then. Number one, we're eye level with patients now. And most pharmacies are designed to be open and interactive with patients to allow interaction with the pharmacist and the patient. But while dispensing medications and verifying prescriptions remains an important role of community pharmacists, pharmacists are doing a lot more these days. They can modify prescriptions, they can renew prescriptions, they can dispense emergency prescriptions if you've run out of your medications and you can't see a doctor. Pharmacists are administering immunizations. I think last year pharmacists administered about 30% of all the flu shots in the province. Pharmacists are offering point-of-care testing. Some are offering HIV screening. I know in Ontario they participate in a colorectal screening program as well. And pharmacists are performing more consultation type services with patients to help them manage complex medications. So pharmacists are doing a lot more to help patients manage their medical conditions and their medication regimens. Now, in terms of adverse drug reactions, I've kind of boiled it down to 3 simple roles that the pharmacists kind of play in terms of managing and preventing adverse drug reactions. So kind of the first role is preventing adverse drug reactions prior to dispensing a medication. So, they're going to review the prescription that you have, make sure that the medication, the dosing makes sense for you. Then they're also going to check that prescription against the information that they have about you in their local pharmacy software, and then they will also check that information against the provincial drug information system called PharmaNet to make sure there's no conflict with any allergies that you might have or any conflict with other medications that you're taking. Now also, pharmacists are required, according to their standards of practice, to also speak with you prior to releasing a medication, and that's to make sure that you're informed about how to actually properly use the medication. You're informed about knowing about potential drug or food interactions, and you're aware of potential side effects to expect, and potential side effects that you should be aware of and might need to seek medical attention for. Now, pharmacists also have a role in terms of addressing drug or adverse drug reactions after you've already started taking your medications. With patients who have complex medical conditions or who have who have to see a number of different prescribers, it's very easy for medications to get layered on top of each other. It's much more difficult, I think, from a healthcare practitioner perspective to take people off of medications. And so, it's not uncommon for people, especially seniors who are, an at-risk population, to be put on 5 medications, 7 medications, 10 medications. And when you're on that many medications, there are going to be some cumulative effects. And so pharmacists now are providing these types of consultation services to help have some focus time with patients to review their entire medication regimen, to make sure that the medications are still doing more good than harm, to make sure that medications are actually matching up with indications and conditions that the patient have. And so using pharmacogenomic testing, we can get a new piece of information about the patient, both prior to dispensing medications, but also when you've already started taking medications, to identify medications that might not be appropriate for an individual or might not be working as optimally as it could. So pharmacogenomic testing is another piece of the puzzle, another piece of information that we can use to help people better manage the medications that they're taking. The third role I would say that pharmacists have with regards to adverse drug reactions is, reporting to Health Canada's vigilance program, which is Health Canada's adverse drug reaction monitoring program. So pharmacists are the #1 contributors to that system, but we still know that reporting of adverse drug reactions is still or adverse drug reactions are still grossly underreported, and some studies say to the tune of 94%. So, there still needs to be more done in that way. Now, in terms of adverse drug reactions, there's a number of causes for adverse drug reactions. Some are more immunologic in nature or more kind of allergic or allergy kind of in nature, and some are due to how your body processes medications. And so pharmacogenomic testing has been associated with being able to help address those two types of causes of adverse drug reactions. But you could also have adverse drug reactions based on how you take your medication, or how you don't take your medication, or based on the other medication you're taking, or based on the food that you eat or the environment that you live in. So pharmacogenomic testing is a piece of the puzzle, but it's not kind of the be-all and end-all for preventing adverse drug reactions. Now, in terms of pharmacists and pharmacogenomics, pharmacogenomics is basically the study of your genetics and how that influences the way that you respond to drugs. And so pharmacists, the bulk of our training is learning about how people respond to drugs based on how a drug works, how it's cleared, et cetera. And what we're learning more about now is genetics. So pharmacogenomics has been taught in the pharmacy curriculum for a number of years now, but as that type of technology becomes more mainstream, we're seeing that this type of training is also expanding in the curriculum. And so I think pharmacists are quite well positioned to be able to apply this information and help patients make use of this technology in a meaningful way. And we know that there's a few studies that are happening across Canada that are looking at the feasibility as well as the acceptability and the utility of pharmacogenomics being offered in community pharmacy settings. And one of those studies is happening in BC. The BC Pharmacy Association is collaborating with UBC and has received funding from Genome BC to test this in communities across British Columbia. Now, I don't think there's been any publications necessarily from these studies in Canada, but I've listened to a couple of talks, and some of the preliminary findings are interesting. One is that obviously patients are very interested in pharmacogenomic testing. Recruitment hasn't been an issue in any of these studies. Patients are comfortable getting their pharmacogenomic testing done in the pharmacy. Pharmacists have been able to effectively teach people about pharmacogenomics, conduct the testing, convey the results, and help apply that information to a patient's medication regimen. As well, the acceptability from patients and prescribers based on the recommendations from the pharmacist has been quite high. I think it's been between 70–80% from prescribers and higher than that from patients. So the information is being used. And ultimately, what we're seeing from some studies is that the information is or using the pharmacogenomic information is resulting in better patient outcomes, at least in depression and in the short term. I think what's quite exciting as well is pharmacies across Canada are now offering pharmacogenomic testing. So like Orit mentioned, the BC Pharmacy Association has partnered with MyDNA, which is a genetic testing company, and we're enabling community pharmacies to make this testing available to patients. So there's about 60 pharmacies now that are offering this type of testing in British Columbia. So for me, the takeaways for me are that pharmacists play an important role in preventing and addressing adverse drug reactions. Pharmacogenomics is a tool that can help address gaps in addressing adverse drug reactions, and pharmacists are already providing these services in the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bryce. And our next speaker would be Amani Saini.
Thank you. Thank you to Genome BC for organizing this really important event, which I think is a great initiative because more British Columbians and more Canadians do need to know about the power of pharmacogenomics. So if you had told me 2 years ago that I would be on a panel talking about making use of genomics to prevent adverse drug reactions, I never would have believed you in a million years. That is because 2 years ago, I didn't even know about pharmacogenomics or genetics, but that all changed for me. And today I lead an organization which was just created this year called Adverse Drug Reaction Canada, where we advocate for policies and the prevention of adverse drug reactions by making use of genomics, by implementing electronic health records, and also by advocating for the creation of a national database where we mandatory report and monitor all adverse drug events. So in 2010, my little sister, she was 19 years old. She was a student at the University of British Columbia, and she had just participated in a UBC rec event. And after that event, she got the common cold, and as most students would, she went to UBC Student Health Services. So for those of you who are not familiar, UBC Student Health Services is a walk-in clinic that's located at UBC Hospital, and it's open to students. So once she got there, the doctor there told her that she had the common cold and she needed to take fluids, get some rest, and the doctor there also gave her a sample of a cold and sinus drug. Now, this cold and sinus drug is the most common ibuprofen drug on the market. Perhaps I'm guessing that most individuals or all individuals in the audience here have taken this ibuprofen drug that I'm talking about, and perhaps you even took it this morning. So after she took this ibuprofen drug, she went back to her residence, and in a little over 24 hours, her eyes had swelled up, they had turned red, and she went back to, the next day, she went back to UBC Student Health Services, and they told her that she needs to go to VGH and see an eye care specialist. When she went to go see the eye care specialist examined her eyes and saw that by this point there was also rash all over my sister's face and the lower part of her body. And that eye care specialist wasn't able to locate a dermatologist. And so that's another problem in our province as well, that we don't have enough dermatologists. So the eye care specialist dismissed her and told her that if her condition continues to worsen, she should seek further medical attention. So after that, when she did go back to her residence, her condition did start to worsen. And at that point, she contacted my parents. My parents live in Abbotsford. They picked her up and they brought her to the hospital in Abbotsford. At this point, it had been about 48 hours since she had taken this ibuprofen drug. And now there were blisters starting to appear on the top half of her body, which were the size of golf balls. At the emergency room there at Abbotsford Hospital, they could not figure out what was happening to her. So they sent her by ambulance back to VGH, and at VGH, they did a biopsy. And that biopsy showed that she had an adverse drug event to this ibuprofen drug, and they told us that she now had this disease called toxic epidermal necrolysis, and she would pass away in a few days. Afterwards, my sister was admitted to the burn, plastic, and trauma unit. And after that, when her condition started to worsen and it wasn't getting any better, she was sent to the ICU. And we were told basically to prepare for the worst. So my sister ended up spending 3 weeks at Vancouver General Hospital. This was an individual who's a 19-year-old girl, incredibly smart, incredibly healthy, just studying for her midterms at UBC, to somebody who's in the ICU and is we are told, going to pass away. So after a 3-week ordeal, my sister did end up surviving. And at that point, I was told by the healthcare professionals that were working there that there wasn't anything that could have prevented her adverse drug reaction from occurring, that there wasn't any mechanisms that we had in place that would prevent this ADR from occurring anywhere really in Canada. That adverse drug reactions, they are very common, but we haven't found a solution to prevent them. So from that adverse drug reaction, the worst thing that did happen to my sister that she still lives with today is that she has chronic dry eye. So for the rest of her life, every 2 hours or so, she will have to lubricate her eyes, so which involves putting these incredibly expensive eye drops into her eyes, and then also going out to see an eye care specialist every month or so. So that happened in 2010, and here we are in 2017, 7 years after, and still every month she's going to go see an eye care specialist. Every month there's costs that are incurring in the healthcare system because of an event that happened back in 2010. So that was something that happened in 2010, and not knowing about genomics, So back in 2015, I was just procrastinating, scanning through the internet, reading various articles, and I very randomly came across an article that was published in The Atlantic. And this article talked about this brand new science of genomics and how many countries around the world, in particular Thailand, Taiwan, and Singapore, they were starting to prevent many diseases from occurring in their citizens. And in particular, they were preventing adverse drug reactions from occurring in their citizens. And when I examined this article that was published in The Atlantic, afterwards I contacted the researchers that had been mentioned in these articles. And I also read journal articles that they had published. And when I contacted these researchers, what they told me was astonishing. They told me that my sister's disease, they had actually got rid of it in 2005. And my sister here in our jurisdiction in British Columbia, she had got her disease in 2010. So what did they do differently that we didn't do? So what Thailand and Taiwan did was they saw that there were a lot of individuals that were coming into their emergency rooms and into their hospitals that were presenting themselves with an adverse drug reaction. And what they started to do was they started to keep track who these individuals were, what drugs they had taken, and afterwards they would test these individuals to see what gene variants they carried. For example, there was a lot of individuals that were coming into hospitals in Taiwan who had taken the drug carbamazepine. And using that drug, what they did was all those individuals who had got toxic epidermal necrolysis, the same disease my sister had, from that drug, they tested those individuals and they found out that they carried the same gene variant and HLA variant. So from that evidence, they were able to determine that individuals who carry this gene variant, they should not be prescribed a certain drug. So these countries, what they do now, Thailand, Singapore, and Taiwan, what they do is before they even prescribe a drug to an individual, if they know that this drug could result in an adverse drug reaction, they test the individual first to see if they carry a gene variant that could cause this adverse event. So my takeaway from learning this was if my sister had been prescribed this ibuprofen drug or another drug in any of these jurisdictions in Thailand and Taiwan or Singapore, perhaps she would never have had her adverse drug event. And what that also meant for me was that my sister, who had to drop out of school, she had to drop out of UBC, she still lives in fear and was traumatized from her experience. And everything that resulted from that experience. Think about the healthcare costs that were incurred from having stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks. And also my family members who had to take time off from work in order to care for my sister. That perhaps would not have occurred if we had decided that before we prescribe a drug to an individual, we're going to test them to see what gene variants they carry. And what that also meant for me was every year, if you're not aware, adverse drug reactions are the 4th leading cause of death in Canada. Every year, they're anywhere between the 3rd to the 5th leading cause. Every year, up to 22,000 Canadians die from an adverse drug reaction. And these are not just 22,000 individuals we're talking about. We're also talking about the impact that it has on their careers, the impact that it has on their family members. And these 22,000 individuals that die, there's 22,000 families behind them. There's 22,000 families that have to make funeral arrangements every year because of something that is preventable. And I highly believe that if Thailand, Taiwan, and Singapore are able to do it, then Canadian jurisdictions are able to do it as well. And I do believe that once we do harness the power of genomics, we can go about preventing adverse drug reactions. And maybe, perhaps, one day, hopefully, my dream is that they will not be the 4th leading cause of death in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your excellent presentations. And now that we've all heard how pharmacogenomics will ensure the right drug is prescribed in the right dose, at the right time, to the right patient, let me start the Q&A session with 2 short questions to our panelists. The first one is directed to Martin. Martin, can you elaborate on the prevalence of adverse drug reactions in Canada?
Yes, we've fortunate actually in Vancouver to have had work done at Vancouver General Hospital looking at emergency rooms there and a number of people who have adverse drug events as the cause of coming into the emergency room. It's about 12%. And what they also then went on to discover is that the cost of looking after those individuals compared to the cost of people who are coming in with other problems was about 4 times higher. We know that 5%, roughly 5% of patients admitted to hospital worldwide, in Canada probably, but the data isn't maybe as hard, 5% are due to adverse drug reactions. That is the drugs we prescribe.
Thank you. The second question is directed to Bryce. How effective is pharmacogenomic testing? And we've heard that it has been implemented globally. How would BC decide which test to implement or even recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to answer how effective is pharmacogenomics, it's kind of a difficult to answer to summarize in one sentence. I mean, because it depends on the drug that you're talking about and it depends on the gene that you're looking at in particular. But there's been a number of studies which have demonstrated that pharmacogenomic testing, for instance, in the area of depression has been able to improve health outcomes as well as improve adherence to antidepressant medication. And there's a number of international guidelines that provided pharmacogenomic dosing recommendations based on all of the available evidence that exists presently that most pharmacogenomic testing providers use in terms of generating their results and recommendations. In terms of where BC should start, I guess in terms of what tests or what genes, I mean it's kind of like the $1 million question, and but I think that even looking at the genes and the drugs which have a significant human impact, like the carbamazepine, and they also have a significant economic impact on the healthcare system acutely, but also chronically, like down the road in terms of the long-term management for those patients. I mean, that's a place to start. But at the same time, we also know that testing for multiple genes at the same time is going to be more cost-effective than looking at specific genes one at a time. So I'm not sure exactly.
Is there any criteria to decide that you're going to use this specific genes and it's approved?
Well, I mean,
versus others?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be the humanistic impact is one thing to consider, but also the economic impact of whether that test is going to generate some kind of, I guess, cost savings to the healthcare system in terms of preventing significant adverse drug reactions down the road.
Yeah.
So there is an international group, because this is really important information. It's run out of Stanford in the United States, and they collect the information on the clinical effectiveness of using pharmacogenetics to prevent adverse drug reactions. And they have a table of basically levels of evidence for each drug and each variant. So one can go to that sort of table and say, this would be the most effective choice for primary care, for cancer, for mental health, for cardiovascular. And that is what a lot of groups around the world are using. But we're all sharing the data. I mean, it is one of the, it's rather like HIV. It is one of the few occasions where all the universities are coming together to share the information, which is great. And so we will be seeing very similar panels coming out from all the individual companies that are involved in this in the near future.
Thank you very much for your comments. We will now take questions from the audience, but just a note that if possible, keep your questions short and to the point. We have a lot of people and many questions. By the way, we do have a mic, and so just raise your hand, and Catherine will pass the mic to you.
Okay, so I have a question about the adverse reactions that you find. They are known already through the clinical trials? The adverse reactions that you're observing, are there already known adverse reactions from the clinical trials?
There are. So clinical trials testing drugs often look at about 2,000 people generally.
I know.
And if the reaction is 1 in 20,000, it won't catch it. So there often this is why the importance of reporting adverse drug reactions is critical, because the trials are just not large enough to catch, unless they're common, all the adverse drug reactions.
So something really important that doesn't take place in Canada is that, well, so right now in Canada, we don't have a mandatory reporting database for adverse drug reactions. So we do have something that Bryce talked about, which is the Canada Online Adverse Drug Reaction Vigilance Database, but reporting to it is not mandatory right now. So other countries, when it came to them identifying what drugs would cause an adverse drug reaction, what they did was, once an individual would enter their hospitals, and what they would do is they would record exactly which drug that individual took, and then afterwards they were able to go back to that individual and ask that individual for a DNA sample in order to determine what the gene variants are. In our hospitals in Canada, once a patient goes into an emergency room or is admitted to a hospital and they do have an adverse drug event, we're not recording that information. We're not recording which gene variants they carry. So when, as Martin was saying, there are clinical trials that aren't large enough, so we can't for sure say that certain drugs and certain gene variants can cause an adverse drug event because the trial wasn't large enough. But what these other countries have done was absolutely tremendous. It was just about organizing their system. So it was just about recording the drug and also recording what gene variants that individual carried. And once there was a certain number of cases, suppose, for example, it was like 1,000 or 2,000 cases, which showed that individuals coming in with this drug and having this gene variant, and they had an adverse drug event, then that meant that they could say that having this gene variant and taking this drug meant that you would have an adverse drug event, and they would no longer prescribe a drug to an individual who had that gene variant.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is, even if the adverse drug reaction is known to be associated with a drug, using our traditional information, there's no way that we can predict who's going to react in a certain way. Oh, okay, sure.
Hello, Martin. It's Chris here. How are you? Martin, I wonder if you could tell myself and the audience about any advances made with respect to ingestion of any product, whether pharmaceutical, food, or otherwise, into the gut, and the reaction to bacteria transmitting signals to the brain, neurons, and transmitters, and sending it back and making people ill. That's number one. Where we are in that scheme of things right now. And number two is, I understand that there is a seminar or a large conference at University of British Columbia coming up this December with respect to professionals. And is it targeting the exact topic that you're talking about?
I'm not sure about the second question. The first one I think you're getting at is the microbiome. So what we have 3 trillion bacteria and fungi on us and in us, which is a bit scary. And they make us what we are in a way. They also the way we absorb foods and the way we absorb drugs. So if I give an antibiotic to someone, clearly that has an impact on the bacteria in the gut and can lead to considerable problems. Clostridium difficile is one example of that. So yes, the bacteria and fungi on us and in us are critical, and there are descriptions of feedback loops where you can get into a spiral of problems with drugs or what we eat. It's not always the drugs at fault. It can be, whether we have a dog or a pet or whatever at home, altering the microbiome in our gut, and that actually causing diseases or maybe preventing diseases. So it's an early science at the moment. We're still unpacking it. It's very difficult. We're using DNA to actually identify where the bacteria and fungi are in your poop, basically. It's deep frozen, crushed, and then we look for the DNA of the bacteria and the fungi and the viruses, perhaps, in your poop, and that actually gives us a picture of your biome. And you can do that because sequencing is relatively inexpensive and relatively accurate. You can do that with lots and lots of people. So we're starting to discover associations between what's in you and what's on you and how you feel.
I have a part two to that question. Is there commercially available testing for that, or is that done through your family physician and sending it out to the University of British Columbia?
There are trials going on, and Molecular U, I think, offers that microbiome testing.
And one last thing. I feel like a preacher. Martin has a colleague. His name is Dr. Peter Cullis, and he has an exceptional book called Medicine Revolution, Prescriptive Personalized Medicine. I suggest everybody buy that book and read it, and you will get the genesis of what Martin and the diocese is speaking about. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
I didn't prompt Chris to say any of that. And Peter's a good friend, a colleague of mine, and I do echo, actually. I mean, it is a very readable book, and you can dip in and out of it, and it will give you a little glimpse of where we are now, but also the future, which is quite exciting.
So we have a question from Twitter. How could pharmacists and family doctors work together to make pharmacogenomic testing accessible to patients?
We work together very well, don't we?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, I guess there's no model to base it on right now, but I mean, I think that based on some of the studies that have happened in Canada, we see that if pharmacists are the ones to do the testing and the ones to deliver the results to the patients, they then would make the recommendations to the physician, and based on what we've seen from the study is that the physicians tend to accept most of the recommendations coming from the pharmacist. And but I mean, it could also happen the other way, that the physician is the one to offer the testing and to deliver the results to the patient, and then convey that information to the pharmacist who's going to be dispensing the medications as well.
Our version is similar to that, but it's the complexity of identifying the drugs and the doses of drugs that is actually above and beyond my skill as a physician a lot of the time, and I would say the skills of a pharmacist, because it just takes too much time to identify every single variable and all the genetics. And actually there's going to be more information as we start recording and going forward. And so it'll be systems that help both of us identify drugs for the individual, and hopefully we'll be using the same system with the same information. And there is no reason that a pharmacist cannot explain how to take the drugs and what the expected benefits should be as much as a family physician. There's a huge trust element. We know our local pharmacists, we know our local physicians, and I think that it's working with both of them together, and we've been working together for centuries, so I think that you'll see that carrying on.
Do we have further questions?
Yeah.
Yes. Is this on? Yeah. I hear that in Canada and likely in the world, Martin, you said in your presentation, there's about 500,000 people dying of these kind of reactions every year. In Canada, we hear these numbers between 22,000 to 25,000 people dying every year, and I haven't heard anything about the numbers going down in any way. So it seems like nobody cares. It seems like what's going on here. And the clinical trials, I heard someone saying that even the clinical trials are not really effective because they can catch stuff within even 20,000 people in a sample. So my question maybe to you, Amani, is have you looked through your alliance to social media? because in the United States, we have seen a lot of, a new way of looking at clinical trials. Yeah, and in particular in this case, let's say in the last 5 years in Canada alone, we have 110,000 to 125,000 families that have, like you, problems. Yeah, and so these are people who died. We know, what happened there, I suppose. So would your alliance work with, UBC, with pharmacists and all that, to start doing something about it, so that we can bring Canada closer to where Thailand and Singapore is? And have you done anything in that space? That's the question.
So the organization, it just launched a few months ago, and Martin is actually an advisor on the organization. So we are working with stakeholders all across the board. There's pharmacists who are involved in the organization, policy makers, family physicians, patients, patient family members. So I mentioned before, so the problem that we have here in Canada is that we don't have a national database. So the database that we do have, it is mandatory to report adverse drug events. So that information, the crucial information that we're looking for to see what exactly is it that's killing Canadians, we don't have that. And if we don't have that evidence, then we can't really act upon it. We really need that evidence in order to decide which drugs is it that we need to examine and which drugs should potentially perhaps not even be on the market. So in 2014, there actually was an amendment to the Drug and Food Safety Act. And during that time, and that amendment, it later became known as Vanessas Law, and it was introduced by an MP in Ontario. He was a Tory MP, Terrace Young, and Terrace Young's daughter had passed away from an adverse drug reaction. So she was a 15-year-old girl, and she took a drug that her doctor had prescribed her, and she had a heart attack, and she passed away. So this legislation was introduced, which was an amendment to the Drug and Food Safety Act. And that legislation said that healthcare institutions across the country need to mandatory report to this national database. And what we recently heard this summer, if you had been following the news, was that Health Canada is not going to make it mandatory, because that piece of legislation does not say that all healthcare institutions need to mandatory report. So that is something that we can all do right now, advocate to our members of parliament, to Health Canada, that really the spirit of that legislation that was brought forward, we really need to act upon it. But once we do have that information, then I think we will be able to actually go about making change.
Well, Martin, I mean, you are in this business, obviously. Darren Entwistle's father, the CEO of TELUS, died out of a medical error. So how bad is this problem? Why in the world can we not solve it?
So I was at a meeting at the weekend with primary care researchers, 1,100 of us are from around the world, mostly from North America. And one of the speakers, Dee Mangin, who is a phenomenal researcher at McMaster, just stolen from New Zealand, she was talking about polypharmacy, taking multiple drugs and the dangers of that, and talking about choosing wisely. And she had this image of two 747 jets crashing every day, which is what it is. And she said, if that was happening, would you fly on that airline? Clearly not. But it seems to be that the images of adverse drug reaction deaths don't seem to loom as high in the public, our minds, as an aircraft crashing. So I don't know what it's going to take, but it's sitting here with death after death after death, and these are deaths, and there are many injuries that are not as severe. I don't know what we have to do to change it. I think maybe the public really needs to be the one, and voices like Amani's.
Just to add to that, it is a problem, but we don't know how big the problem is, just because we haven't been recording which drugs Canadians are dying from. So until we actually start recording that, until we actually start monitoring the drugs that are killing Canadians, I don't think it really is a problem for government.
Thank you.
Hi, this is a question for all of you, please. So what we're finding as a result of like these talks and what everybody is interested in here is that the Canadian healthcare system, like while it does do some great things, there's lots of gaps and opportunities to improve. And like the issue of adverse drug reactions and deaths is often a result of miscommunication or lack thereof. And I would like to hear from each of you, like, how long do you think it's going to take, and what do you think the major obstacles are going to be before there's a more integrated and communicative, proactive approach between all of a person's healthcare practitioners, whether it's a person seeing like their doctor or their pharmacist or their nutritionist or their dietitian or whatever other types of therapies that it is that they're undertaking, so that there's a more like bigger picture vision of a person's health and any data that there is about a person medically or any types of illnesses, et cetera, predispositions that they might have, that gives people a better idea of how to treat each person. Thank you.
I mean, the BC Pharmacy Association, we've been involved in a number of talks for I don't know how many years, where we've been talking with government around having an integrated electronic information system where, labs are going to talk to EMRs, EMRs are going to talk to pharmacy software, and I have no idea when that's coming. I mean, it's been coming for I don't know how many years, right? So, I mean, I know I know the government is working on it. I know everybody is looking at it, but in terms of the time frame, I don't know when it might happen.
Estonia gave every individual in the country a personal chip and PIN card to hold their electronic data, their personal data, about 10 years ago. Just saying. Quebec, not maybe the most advanced province in some ways, obviously in cuisine the most, has got an integrated dossier santé électronique, which is a system where I, as a family physician, because I worked there for a long time, can see every image that's taken, ultrasound, MRI, CAT scan. I can see every blood test taken from anywhere. I can see every drug that's prescribed, and it's integrated into my electronic medical record. So it is happening province by province. And it will happen here.
So one of the steps that Thailand and Taiwan took in order to prevent adverse drug reactions was they actually created a genetic ID card. So every individual who has had an adverse drug reaction, or every individual for whom they know which gene variants they carry, they all receive a genetic. They'll receive a card, and that card has a number on it, which is very similar to our healthcare card. And once you go to a new healthcare professional or any healthcare professional in the healthcare system in Thailand and Taiwan, all the healthcare professional has to do is put in that number, and the first thing that pops up on their screen is exactly which gene variants an individual carries and which drugs you should not be prescribing that individual. So other jurisdictions have done it, and I believe that we can do it as well. Where I personally see it taking hold would be here in British Columbia, we do have a system where we do record which drugs a person is on. We have PharmaNet. So with PharmaNet, if your doctor prescribes you a drug and you go to your local pharmacy and you go there, you pick up the drug, and suppose that you need a refill. That refill, you're able to fill your drug anywhere in the province. And once you are admitted to an hospital in British Columbia, any doctor and healthcare provider is able to log into PharmaNet, put in your information, and they're able to see exactly which drugs you have taken and which drugs you actually purchased and which drugs you still need refills for. So I think that is a great example that we have in British Columbia where we have seen some form of sharing information. And I think at the end of the day, if we were going to start somewhere, I think that would be a great opportunity where we could start because we already have that infrastructure in place. And all we would need to do is expand on that infrastructure that already exists.
Those are all great answers. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for coming and having this talk with us tonight. My son developed refractory psychosis 3.5 years ago, and through the process, he progressively got sicker and sicker. And what the refractory psychosis means that it's medically, it's just not responding to medications and treatments. So in the course of this illness, as he got sicker and sicker, and then they're switching the medications, and then he again getting sicker to the point that he was in the UBC psychosis unit in UBC, and the doctor there was recommending electric shock therapy and institutionalization. He was that bad. During this time, I came across articles because I was questioning like what was going on with him, and came across the subject of CYP genes. Approached the doctor at UBC with that and wanting some testing, and he had said to me at the time, in my 20 years of practice, this is, it's just a waste of time, and he refused it. So I said, frankly, I'm shocked. You're in this, the only unit in British Columbia. Why wouldn't you look at this? Long story short, a test was done via another doctor that was into research, and there's 6 out of all the CYP genes. There's the top 6 that do 95% of the work, and in my son, 4 of them were knocked out. So there was no medication. All the medication that he had been put on, he should never have been put on. He was in liver failure, toxic hepatitis. His heart was affected, certainly his brain. He's cost the system over $200,000 by my estimate because of this, and not because of the illness, but because of the course of treatment. And there's the medication, it's not the actual medication fault because it helps a lot of different people, but his actual phenotype couldn't tolerate this. Now he's on a certain medication that's being brought from Europe specifically for him. Doesn't route through his liver. He's 85% recovered already. 85%. Don't expect him to be hospitalized again. He hasn't had to have electric shock therapy. His brain is he's in recovery. 85%. Had a test been available 3 years ago to check his phenotype, the doctors then would have known right away, this guy can't be on this. He would have been in recovery, 2.5 years ago, right away. So it's really important. It's important that people know, and I think it's with education, and I think it's with push. I do understand that psychiatrists are kind of balking at this, which I don't really understand, a lot of them, because it's not part of the education. This is a lot of doctors, because it hasn't been mandatory. It's just kind of like coming into it. But it's important. Also, the test too for my son was it was free because the research guy got it routed through San Diego or something. But it's a test that apparently costs less than $200. And is that kind of the benchmark here that you'd be looking at?
So we, through Life Labs, it's about $400, and it's a bigger panel, I think. The health authorities are starting to get into this. There are psychiatrists we're working with who come to us and say, we might have a patient, and we then discuss our panel, and we actually say no about half the time to the psychiatrist, saying, actually, we really don't think this is actually going to help. And then, because of the condition or because of the drugs or whatever. So we're actually pretty cautious about selling it to people. We want to make sure that people have the realistic expectations of the benefits of doing this. It can't save everyone, but you're absolutely right. With stories like that, and the psychiatrists are getting it. We're getting more interest. Health authorities are now starting to come and say, maybe we could have a test for a patient. So it is starting to happen.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of cost, I would say that the test that's being offered through pharmacies is a little bit of a narrower panel than the one that Martin's company is offering, or that's done through Life Labs, I should say, but it costs about $200 or less.
Thank you. Yes?
Is it possible to get a list of labs that one can approach to get various tests to find out if the medications there are effective or not effective, or they should be taking something else, or in stronger or weaker doses, or if they're being metabolized properly? I mean, there's a lot of knowledge out there, but I don't know who to approach. There's probably 1,000 companies, and they all have different specialties. And it's just a matter of having the knowledge of who's in the market, who's doing what, and trying to tailor the test to each individual. A person who's older may have a different kind of test performed by a different company for someone who's younger or something like that. It's a matter of acquiring the knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I can say for the company that we're working with, if you go to their website, there's a pharmacy finder there, so you can find a pharmacy that is offering this type of testing, and you can talk to them to see whether that test might be appropriate for you.
And you said there are pharmacies here in the Lower Mainland of Vancouver that you can approach, because I get a few medications from a pharmacy and they don't have any knowledge of this. They say, check around, you'll get onto something, and I approach a doctor, say for diabetes or for heart, and they're not into this. They do their best, they're very sincere people, but they don't have any knowledge of this, and they're so busy they probably don't have time to acquire the knowledge. So I'm just wondering if I'm seeing the right people.
Yeah, no, I mean, we can talk after the talk. I can give you the website address as well, and then you can look it up. But
excellent, that'd be appreciated.
So if you go to Life Labs as well, there's a drug checker there, and then there's more information as well.
So just one question to follow up on this. How can we ensure privacy and security? And who would have access to this data, for interpretation of genetic variants?
So one thing to be really clear about is that pharmacogenetics is just about the metabolism of drugs. And the companies generally, not always, generally will stick away from any test that is likely to be a predictor of disease risk because that requires counseling. It's a very different way of interpretation. So we will talk about doing 90 markers or 60 markers or 30 markers for different drugs. What we will all try and avoid, most of the companies, will be doing any sort of test that might have an association with the disease. And there is a bit of crossover, so there is a variant that will actually predict Alzheimer's, not terribly accurately, don't worry, it's not super good, but it does indicate an increased risk. And it also predicts how you will metabolize statins, simvastatin, atorvastatin. So we actually don't offer that because we don't want to give people information that might require counseling. So it's really important that the information mostly in pharmacogenetics is just about drugs, which means it's not as critical. Most of us keep the information on Canadian servers. Most of us actually keep it behind firewalls that's well protected. And if the information did get out that you are an ultra metabolizer of codeine, I think the value to people would be negligible. Whereas the value of maybe susceptibility to disease would be more. So there are lots of processes of looking after healthcare information, and most of the companies are abiding by those regulations.
Thank you.
Okay. This question originally I thought was a bit irrelevant, but it's actually funny how you just kind of brought it up. I was wondering, because somewhat recently, the FDA has approved the company 23andMe for direct-to-consumer testing, where you don't need a medical professional in between anymore. Do you have any thoughts about it? Do you approve of this, or?
I mean, the model that we've adopted is that the test will have to be delivered by a healthcare professional. In our case, it's a pharmacist, and we think that's an important step because even though the information can be translated in relatively lay language that's relatively easy to understand, knowing what to do with that information and navigating, talking with your physician about that information can be a challenge for some people. And so we think that having a healthcare professional help to deliver that information and actually apply that information to your medication regimen is probably the safest way to go about it. What we don't want is people getting results where they don't necessarily need to make any changes to their medication regimen, and based on their results, it says, oh, maybe you should do something different, and so they make a change that's not necessary. And so we do think it's important for this type of information to be delivered through a healthcare professional.
And we have a slightly different point of view. We actually think that patients with the right software, which is written for patients, can actually make the interpretations themselves. Now, with Life Labs as a partner, we are definitely going down the route of you go to your health professional, pharmacist, or physician and get a requisition, but you can still get it direct to consumer because access is still difficult for some people. 16% of people in BC don't have access to a primary care health professional. So recognizing that, we're still making it at the moment available direct to consumer, but with special software to interpret that information. 23andMe certainly does deliver things direct to consumer. And I think the other part of this is we want to put this in the power of people's iPhones and smartphones, so when they can go to a pharmacy, they can actually look and see, oh, I can take this drug, because a lot of this stuff is over the counter, as you were hearing from Amani. So this is not necessarily just prescription medications that we're talking about.
Thanks. You've almost answered my question. I've had my genome done. Is there an app that I can dump the data into to get this information for myself so that I can be responsible for it and present it instead of relying on the healthcare system, which everybody seems to be dumping on? Is there something that I can do personally?
Yeah, there is a difficulty with other tests. You can have 5 variants for this SIP, something that we were talking about with psychotropic medication. Right. 3 of them could be saying you should have a lower dose, and 2 of them could be saying you should have a higher dose. The interpretation of that is difficult, which is where you need the software to come in. But if you've only had 4 done in the panel that you had, the software won't work because it's expecting 5 variants. Right. And so we actually cannot take tests from other companies because I actually have my 23andMe done, and it said I should actually have a lower dose of a proton pump inhibitor. When I did our company's test, which was more variants, it said, no, you can take a normal dose. So it really depends on the company's tests that you're doing. And so we don't have that translational ability to take information. Unless they're doing exactly the same as we are, we can't take that information. And I think that's going to be a barrier moving from one test and putting it into another group's interpretation process. Whether it's software or whether it's a report, it's quite difficult because of the number of variants each company does and how they do their tests.
Yeah, I understand that. Thanks a lot. But I'm just trying to be proactive here instead of being dependent, right?
Would I, if I went through Life Labs or whatever, would I get a genetic ID card? And where would I get the internal, like my gut stuff, the poop done?
Okay, the poop is done by a group called Molecular U, and they're a company set up, also a spin-out company of UBC. You can see the theme here. Everything's coming from UBC. So Molecular U will do your poop. Life Lab...
Approximate cost?
I'm not sure, actually. It depends on what you're doing, because they do a whole range of tests, and I'm not actually current with what they will charge. And your second question was about interpretation of the results from Life Labs, or?
No, would I get a genetic ID card to
No,
know?
it's online. So you will register to have a test done, and just like actually any Life Labs test, it's held on a system like Acceleris, so that it's available to any physician anywhere that you share the data with.
Thank you.
Catherine, we have a question here.
Thanks to the panel. If I were the type of individual that went to Life Labs who, I think in partnership with a German company, Centogene, in addition to doing genotyping, would also do whole exome sequencing or whole genome sequencing. And we were willing to write the check for right now it looks like $8,000 for WGS. And I took that to a family physician going forward in life for purposes of determining the efficacy of a drug that might be prescribed to treat conditions that come up. Do you see value in that?
No. I'm going to be very blunt here. I've had a full genome report land on my desk, and it was really hard. And I know my way around genetics a little bit, as much as a family medicine expert in genetics, not as a geneticist. And it was so difficult. And then there are little bits of nuance here. So we're talking about this allergic reaction causing skin problem. Actually, it's every organ of the body that tends. And that's on a part of the gene that isn't normally sequenced in or detected in whole genome sequencing, or may not be. So it is going to be difficult to take that at the moment, but that in the future, there'll be machines that will just and take it straight out and convert it. Right now, if you go and get that test, you might have 90% or maybe 80% of what we could use, but I can't guarantee that you'll have everything.
Okay, so wait is the answer. Just on funding, maybe you can comment on the funding that genetic research in BC gets compared to, Ontario, other provinces in Canada, or perhaps other countries in the world. We heard about Singapore, Thailand, and so on, and the kind of money in the areas they're pumping money into genetically. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the whole of Genome BC is funded jointly by the BC government and Genome Canada. I mean, there's an enormous amount of resources. And if you think about all of the academic resources at UBC that's also funded through BC, you start to get to very, very large numbers. If you look at the number of sequencing labs we have in BC, if you think about Children's Hospital, if you think about the whole genome sequencing you can get for a child who's got developmental problems within weeks, and amazing interpretation. If you think about the cancer center, where you've got this personalized oncogenomics, where $50,000 of interpretation of the sequence of the tumor, I think actually this province is one of the most advanced and resourced. We always struggle with resources, but in terms of the skills here, it really is unparalleled.
For the countries that I mentioned, Thailand and Taiwan and Singapore, it really wasn't about funding, but it was actually about redirecting their healthcare costs. So what they found was that there was way too many individuals that were coming into their healthcare facilities that were there because of an adverse drug event. And they decided that now what they're going to do instead is that they're going to redirect those healthcare costs. So they decided that instead of treating individuals after they've had an adverse drug event, let's start preventing those adverse drug events. So they started, so what Taiwan actually did was they actually made genetic testing part of their national health care insurance. So an individual is able to get a genetic test done for free, and it's all government funded. So all the money that they're saving from having to treat patients down the road, they're actually using that to fund this new system where you can get a genetic test done for free. And one of the policies that Adverse Drug Reaction Canada does advocate for is that one of the policies that we introduced is that governments should also be providing these genetic tests for free. And also, right when a child is born into a hospital in British Columbia, there's already a number of other tests that we do on a newborn. So why not also ask the parents if they would like to find out what gene variants their child carries. And we can use that from day one, from the first day a child is born, to determine what possible allergies they could have to drugs down the road. I think for Thailand and Taiwan and Singapore, it was really a realization from their government that healthcare costs, adverse drug reactions were really eating up their healthcare costs. If the figures are still the same as they were a few years ago, here in British Columbia, our emergency rooms, the individuals that they treat for adverse drug events, it ends up costing BC $45 million each year. So that's coming from the study that Martin mentioned before that was done by UBC Emergency Medicine in 2011. And overall in Canada, the last figures showed us that adverse drug reactions overall across the country, they end up costing the Canadian healthcare system anywhere between $13.7 billion to $17.7 billion. So that's a huge cost to our healthcare system. Is not sustainable at the end of the day. I think a government just needs to realize that and redirect costs towards funding genetic testing.
Thank you very much, everyone. We ran out of time, sorry. We are going to stay here for another 15 minutes, so you can see us later on. So just to conclude, there is a great opportunity for us in BC to prevent unnecessary hospitalization, improve patients' outcome, and save the system some money. There are still challenges for implementation of pharmacogenomic testing, but hopefully this can be overcome through development of decision support tools, established genetic associations, and involvement of reimbursement agencies, community labs, patients, and policymakers. And now I believe this is time to thank our speakers on behalf of Genome BC for a job well done. Thank you very much. I would like also to thank my colleagues from Genome BC Communication for organizing this wonderful event, and of course to thank each and every one of you for joining us and really showing that you care. We will stay here, as I said, for another 15 minutes, so if you have any further questions,